Hello, I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro.
Welcome to Shake and Not Burn. Every day we're bombarded with headlines of crisis and disruption, from climate shocks to inequality to AI upheaval.
But behind the noise are choices, patterns, and opportunities. What we need is sustainability literacy, the clarity and confidence to interpret complexity, see trade-offs, and make decisions.
Our podcast goes beyond the headlines to uncover how real people are tackling change and what we can learn from them.
You can use these ideas to stay steady, even unshakable, in a world that feels uncertain.
This is Shaken Not Burned. Hello, and welcome back to Shaken Not Burned, where we shake up sustainability conversations without burning out. Today we're going to be tackling one of the hardest and most important questions that there is. How do we actually measure impact? Without credible, comparable impact data, companies can't steer strategy, investors can't allocate wisely, and the whole system risks falling into greenwash and failure to comply. Today's guest, Nick Catania, is the co-founder and chief architect at ClimatePoint. He's pioneering a solution: harmonised measurement frameworks. That means Scope 4 avoided emissions and tools to make impact data actually useful for decision making. So Nick, welcome to the show. To kick us off, could you explain why impact measurement's so hard and what drew you to get involved in solving this problem?
Thanks for having me, Felicia. The question you nailed on the head there. We know we're doing better, but we at ClimatePoint always ask the question, well, how much better? Show us in the numbers, right? And so that's where we came at this from this entire perspective of, is there a efficient way to do this that we can keep up with the pace that we need to in order to actually reach our net zero strategy? I come from the academic background. I went to NTNU in Trondheim, Norway, studying specifically industrial ecology and life cycle assessment frameworks. We went at this approach treating corporates and supply chains and production like Mother Nature. How can you think of the systems within a circular economy, inputs and outputs? But of course, you take that long academic rigorous approach where you're waiting months for publications. You said, well, this isn't the most effective way to go about these corporate measurement strategies. And you have all these ESG frameworks coming out. There's platforms left and right that are all taking basically a top-down perspective, right? So we came in and we said, well, we want to do the academic rigorous way with this life cycle assessment, come from the bottom up. So we're measuring the supply chains and everything along with what's actually in the individual product.
Okay, so what we're really talking about here is finding a practical way that companies can use impact measurement to understand where they are and how they get to where they need to be. So can you explain what that gap is? Because you've talked about this rigorous approach of academic analysis, and we've talked about the fact that it needs to be about practical, helpful decision-making approaches for businesses. How would you define that gap?
It's a gap of uncertainty. The reality is that and I know this because I have many of my classmates ended up working in large corporates where they were in charge of sustainability metrics for hundreds, if not thousands of people. And it's surprising how few are in those departments, even though they're very large and international, right?
Well, actually, this is something that comes up again and again and again. I've spoken to companies, pretty big companies, and their sustainability team is 3 people and they're responsible for everything. That's reporting, it's understanding, it's strategizing, it's communicating to the board, it's talking to the public. It almost feels like an impossible job. So are we saying that what you're trying to do is help them do things better?
So short answer is yes. In a world where we're prioritizing financial returns and shareholder value, where does that actually make sense to do, where it's not just a nice to have and a feel good, but actually reinforcing our business models?
So how are you solving this problem? What exactly is ClimatePoint doing that is going to be changing the way in which these companies understand what they're doing? Is this about Scope 4?
It's about Scope 4, the avoided impact.
Okay, so talk me through it.
For your audience listening, and I know there's lots of opinions about Scope 4 and we shouldn't, and is it avoided, or, let's not talk about avoided, but just everybody hang on for a second. Let's consider the Scope 4 for the purposes of this conversation, the amount of reduction that I would have had compared to my baseline, or basically my difference.
Oh, and can I just add something for the audience, because this is always one of those issues that we all know that the SBTI framework is considered the gold standard by a lot of different companies. And the idea is you should have absolute emissions reduction year on year, which is an interesting idea, but that doesn't help a company that is growing and displacing the operations of a high carbon intensive business. So it's important that we don't stop doing what we need to do just because we don't agree completely on every precise element of that definition. We've got to kind of build the car as we're driving it, I think is the best way I know how to say it. Okay, so sorry to interrupt, Nick. Talk me through Scope 4.
And just one point on what you said about the growing, because I think this is real critical, and it's right in front of us, but it almost gets lost in the conversation all the time, where it's the paradox of growth. We want to increase shareholder value, continue to make the revenue line go up and to the right, but at the same time, we want the emissions to go down and to the right. So we've got the X happening, right?
Yeah, we're trying to disconnect emissions growth from corporate growth.
Yes, remove the correlation. We take the approach that in order to realign and get rid of that, actually make that X possible, is to measure and quantify the impacts of the single unit and see what we can tweak as part of that particular product or that particular service to bring it down. And so what does this mean for the Scope 4 that you mentioned? Well, how are you going to compare the electric vehicle compared to the internal combustion engine, right?
Yeah.
The delta is the Scope 4. But even that electric vehicle, we got to manufacture the battery. We have to have the full life cycle consideration from production all the way to end of life. How many years is that going to be on the road? What type of electricity mix is that vehicle being charged on? And so with ClimatePoint, we're all about what is that delta projected to show us the scenario, because it's not good enough to take that one point in time. And that's what we see from a lot of the carbon accounting solutions that are out there. It'll be maybe just the production phase, or they don't extend down to that Scope 3.
So I heard a really interesting analogy the other day, which is that we think about time in a way that's not useful. But if we recognize that we exist and that we have impact, not just where we are today, but past, present and future. So we have to think about everything that went in to getting us to where we are today, the impact of what it is today and where it's going to be in the future. Is that a useful way of thinking about it?
Absolutely. And that is the only way to think about it. Some years ago, I know battery technology has continued to improve. But at that time, my institution had done a study that said it took about 8 to 10 years for a electric vehicle for its emissions to basically pay off for itself, right? And now that's for the average size vehicle. If you've got a larger one, SUV style, it's going to take many years. And the key thing is that if the battery does not last over that lifetime, then you've done no better for the planet, right? So that's the type of question we ask with everything. And that's a great example, because you had so many of these companies that have signed on to SBTI of how are we doing our Scope 1, our direct emission strategy, right? We're going to reduce our direct emissions, or the emissions from the tailpipe of the vehicles. So let's just convert everything to electric, and great, problem solved. Well, ClimatePoint, we say you had to manufacture all of those electric vehicles, the new vehicles, and the new batteries. So did you take that into your consideration and what the payoff return is? Because if you only take that snapshot, you might be hitting SBTI on a boom, 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 boom annual level. But on the cumulative, you've actually done a bit worse.
That is a really useful way of looking at it. And this comes back to one of the things that I think we need to be having more conversations about, which is what are the trade-offs of the actions that we're taking, and what does that actually mean? And so what you're really doing is providing a framework where people can identify the underpinnings of the trade-offs they're making.
Exactly. It's about the trade-offs. And just to add a little bit more nuance to that, because it's not that the benefits are only happening in the use phase. It's not that they're only happening in the production phase. You could have lower embodied emissions upstream throughout the value chain, or you might have higher production emissions like the electric vehicle, but lower use emissions. So with ClimatePoint, that's where we do the whole assessment of the value chain. We take the positives and minuses all along the way. And then we have this inflection point, which we brand called reaching the climate point. Branding, when does that crossover happen? When does that inflection point happen? So when you reach the climate point, guess what? If you reach it before 2030, now we're on a 1.5 degree strategy. So now we've brought that into the global target alignments.
I love this. So this is actionable behavior that can align a company with the Paris targets, which, given that everyone's always talking about the fact that, well, we've gone past 1.5, we're now on 2 or 2.5, and there's a lot of doom and gloom, but actually having an approach which is measurable, actionable, and implementable really does change the dynamics of what everyone's talking about.
There was a lot of, I'd say, a lot of empathetic climate financing where it was the feel good and there was extra money in the corporate accounts to invest in these initiatives, right? To say that we're going to invest in the technologies that are going to help us decarbonize. From our perspective, that flow of capital has definitely decreased. Now there's different market outlooks and projections that say that we're just getting ready for another upswing, which everybody hopes for. They want to see more action happening in this space for sure, right? But this goes to the heart of what you're saying of, well, how do we just get it where it's a compliance effort to where are we embedding it, and when does it get embedded is when you're actually using it as a tool for higher revenue, higher strategic insights. And if I may just take another moment on that, of fundamentally you can look at large corporates, they're either de-risking or they're looking to find ways to leverage their capital and increase profits, right? So if you apply that concept just to climate, it means the first thing they're going to do is, how are we not going to get fined millions of dollars for not doing something right?
And the risk of that is increasing a lot.
It is, right? And you've had this mentality of everybody looking around and trying to see what everyone else is doing, not wanting to be the first movers, because if they're the first movers and they're wrong, then they're still called out and it doesn't work. So very easy to see, back to our X, how do we get profits up, emissions down?
Yeah.
And at the same time, be innovative enough to say we're going to be bold enough to actually dive into the fundamentals, the bottom-up approach, ClimatePoint, right? Assessment of the entire value chain, and actually implement those. And I have become acquainted with leadership at various platforms that are doing this, right? And I'm always surprised to hear that even a simple bill of materials, you would think simple, what goes into product X. Most corporates, the very large ones, they don't have that. And then we ask the question, well, how are you operating? What do you mean you don't have a bill of materials? Things just come in, they get put together, they're on the lane and the assembly line, and then they go out the door. And we've got these innovative carbon platforms accounting, right? And they say, oh, we're just going to come in and do AI and match everything up. And they're like, okay, well, we got to find out where to put where we get the list from.
That's the thing. There's brilliant ideas, but if you haven't got the underlying data, what are you going to do? It's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is really clear, and it definitely makes sense to me, even if it's slightly scary that a lot of the things that we're making, we actually don't know what goes into it or where. But what does that mean for the roles of CFOs and boards? Are we seeing impact metrics start to influence real capital allocation? In the end, we're actually talking about a framework that changes the interactions within an ecosystem of finance and business.
Yeah.
So tell me what the CFOs should be doing. Tell me what the boards should be doing and how we persuade them to do it.
That is the question, right? I think CFO, there's more of an entrepreneurial role to be taking, right? Which investments are we doing that are going to properly implement these from both a sustainable and financial take? And so where we're always pushing is, back to this, how is the sustainability person speaking to the board, right? And so we see the CFO as that midpoint, right? If the sustainability person has the idea, what's it going to be financially to invest on it? What's going to be our return on capital? What's going to be our return on carbon? Because that's the interesting.
That's the ClimatePoint part, really, isn't it?
Reaching the ClimatePoint, right? We have to invest in electric vehicles and build them in order to have a reduction over time. The irony is that we're generating more emissions to decrease.
But I like the idea of the return on carbon, because I think that helps to explain exactly what you're talking about. What's it going to do to the carbon emissions?
Where's the upside? Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you think is holding us back the most? Because we just mentioned the problem of measuring things if you haven't got the data. So there's a data access problem, a transparency problem. There's the technical challenges of measurement, but we've been working on this for a few decades, and there are methodologies that are accepted, that are understood, that work, that can be implemented. And then we've got this, I can only call it a sort of cultural, political resistance. And whether that's to accountability per se, which it sometimes feels like, or whether it's resistance to the implementation of new rules, there is definitely pushback. So what do you think's holding us back the most from actually integrating this idea of the climate point?
I think the most is just attention. It's just where we're looking. We've got these corporates looking around on the international stage. They see things moving. They hear other companies taking initiatives and trying things with marketing campaigns. Fortunately, we're seeing a massive decrease in the greenwashing deal.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, it still happens, but you've got a lot of country level legislation that's come in and put legal ramifications on greenwashing. So that was a massive step, and I feel that we're definitely in this transition phase of we're just going to blast. We're done with the days of, hey, we started recycling food at our canteen and recycling our waste paper basket. It's like, okay, guys, thanks for helping.
Thanks for playing.
You're a good contributor, but we're onto that, and now everyone says, okay, that doesn't count anymore. We can't advertise that. That's not the easy marketing department win.
Yeah, that's just a baseline expectation of what you should be doing anyway.
Right. So then the question goes back to the sustainability department and says, well, what can we actually do about this now? Because now that we're seeing fines are more likely to come in. And I think I don't necessarily like this way, but I think that when or if fines come in, that's definitely a motivator.
I mean, right? Let's be honest. The history of the human race seems to be one that is focused on the fact that carrot and stick combined tend to work. You've got a floor for which people can't go below, and you've got encouragement to go above and beyond.
You do. And Felicia, my hometown's the Hudson Valley in New York, which is, they say, the birthplace of the environmental movement. That was with an electric pump storage power plant that was going to destroy half of this mountain on the Hudson River. And then we had the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act come out of those, and those spread across the country, and parts of that were taken around the world. And that's definitely an example of the community coming together, being loud and louder voices together, and then bringing in regulation that's introducing fines, penalties, and then ultimately policy chains, which then you've got the new companies that ultimately capitalize on that and find the better business model that they introduce. It's hard to see while we're here, but we're in that transition phase where the policies are being enacted. We've got the Paris Agreement that's just coming into play right now. It's 2025 and 2027 are really these first years where we're going to see these massive projects on the multi-million ton abatement, CO2 abatement strategies coming into play around the world in all these countries. And so as we have this new market, we've got carbon as a tradable asset, which the world is still trying to figure out, and hopefully Wall Street treats respectively. Once we have that collateralization, just making we can actually trade and treat carbon as a currency, I think we're going to have these market demands of supply, supply and demand that are just going to evolve this industry to where we're hoping it needs to go.
Now that's interesting, because that is talking about a conceptual interconnection between the voluntary markets and the public markets. Regulation is one of these key things. Often regional or national regulation will be put in place in response to an international agreement. But we are at this point where regulation is not very clear. It was on a very clear trajectory. A lot of it's being reviewed now. How do you see regulation playing out against the voluntary corporate leadership? And I suppose what I'm trying to find out is, where do you think companies should lean into this rather than the wait and see? Where should they focus?
Well, this is why we do what we do at ClimatePoint, right? The answer is always nuanced depending on what product or service you're providing to the market. This gets even more nuanced when you consider a product-based company versus a service like a software, which, if you're working on an app that's helping to prevent deforestation, right? Nobody's caring about the 50 people in your offices that are working on the software production, even though they're using AI, right? They're caring about this scope 4 concept of what have we prevented or helped to prevent in the marketplace that we didn't chop down all those trees, right? And so that could be arguably way more impactful than a corporate reducing to its SBTI targets just because of the level of scale. So that's reinforcing why we do what we do with ClimatePoint, because where is our actual gain the most? And with the product companies, maybe it's the one nuance along the supply chain. There's the institutional funds, right? When we have the green indexes that come out and we have all of the ESG minded portfolios, a lot of what has happened is that they've just reallocated their portfolio away from production, industry, and energy. And so we've done the allocations already. We've played the reallocation game of just, we're not invested in oil. Guess what? The allocation game is basically at the end. Because we can no longer reallocate, let alone get institutional returns that we were we're basically at the end of that risk profile. So we then have to go back into energy production and actually dive in and invest. So that's where we see all of that intensity of focus going. It's no longer how many CO2 renewable energy credits am I going to source on the market. It's actually what am I going to find in my own value chain that I can innovate with.
One of my questions to you was going to be, if harmonized measurements becomes the standard approach, what would shift the fastest? Would it be capital allocation? Would it be corporate behavior? Or would it be innovation pipelines? And what you've actually explained is capital allocation has already gone as far as it can in the current system. And now we have to look at different things. So it's an innovation pipelines internally. It's new businesses with new ideas, providing new tools and using new tools. And it's corporate behavior. I can imagine a multinational that uses a particular chemical, for example, in one product line, that if it gets rid of that could have a big global impact. So is that where we are now? I suppose we're at different stages in all of those aspects. But capital allocation as a solution to the problem, it's been done and now you've got to do something different.
Exactly. And I think that's what we're realizing more and more. And I want to circle back to the Paris Accord deal this for a little bit because, and I can't stress this enough, that even though the Paris Accord was signed and agreed upon some years ago, we're now just seeing everything enacted. So we're going to have all of these effects that are going to start to be noticeable over this next year in 2027 specifically. That being said, you have countries that actually they signed up to take accountability for their own emissions. And what's been happening with these producers in the past is that we've had the great shift of emissions. So we lowered our corporate footprint by outsourcing our emissions to another country.
I remember seeing a report, this was a long time ago, but I remember seeing a report which did an analysis of the UK's emissions, and a third of the UK's emissions were outside UK borders, just from products we use that we brought in from somewhere else. The numbers were crazy.
And so that has been traditionally what the creative accounting has been implicit of where are your emissions? They're not mine, they're happening there. They're beyond our borders. They're in a country that we don't even know what's happening with the electricity mixes, if it's on or off. But now, with 195 countries signed up to the Paris Accord and saying that we have nationally determined contributions, NDCs, that we as a country need to do this, and that has a strict scope of boundary, and that has the focus on the key industries, products, and industrial activities that are taking place in that country. It will become much more difficult for those elements to get lost. And then when the country has to hold face to say that we're reducing this impact of this industry, that's ultimately going to lead back to the companies or state-owned entities that have to bring that out to their value chain. And fortunately, I guess it's a good thing that there's, with these capital markets and the emergence of the carbon credits on Article 6, we're going to have that liquidity that will hopefully push that capital quicker to where it needs to go and have these large-scale projects because they're economically attractive.
There's another point you brought up there, because sometimes the conversation can be, well, what's the point in us doing anything about our emissions, because state-owned enterprises are often those with the highest emissions footprints and that's not being captured. But as you say, if it's filtering down at a national level to those state-owned enterprises because that's what they agreed to, then they're going to have to transform the way they do what they do. Now, I think what would be quite useful, we know where we are at the moment, where are we going?
So we said with the Paris Accord, we're going to have all these carbon credits that have this unique verified stamp, or I don't know if verified is the right word, but they have a certain label to them so they can be traded internationally or on certain registries, right? And then we have the voluntary carbon market, which has existed for quite some years now. And there's speculation about what's going to happen to that market. Most are saying that the value of those carbon credits are going to decrease because just by the mere value of what's happening with the country level approvals, right? And so I think, and I don't know, but I think what's going to happen is you're going to have those type of registries and agencies go more towards keep the voluntary idea and move towards those things like biodiversity credits. We're seeing water credits come up now.
Yeah.
And back to your question, what are we What are we not seeing? What are we looking at? A couple of years ago, I read the book about donut economics.
Yeah.
It was
Kate
very
Raworth.
exciting about that, right? And we had some chats about that before in our earlier conversation, where that book I really loved, and it was great for its time. And I got to the end, and here I am in my studies, and I'm like, okay, what's next? Like, how do we measure it?
How do we
Right?
operationalize it?
How do we operate? Like, I love it. Here's the framework, and here's the boundaries. Like, what do we do? So, in that organization, I've met some of the representatives from there, and I love what they're doing and the conversations that they're driving. Right.
Yeah.
So then ClimatePoint comes and says, can we use your framework and just start to put some numbers on it, like all these other categories: human toxicity, acidification, eutrophication, which is water pollution, right? To actually say, let's go beyond CO. And arguably, the European Union continues to push this area as well, with what's called the product environmental footprint, the PEF. So think about it, where we started this conversation where we said ClimatePoint is doing life cycle assessment, LCA, bottom up measurement, life cycle chain.
Yeah.
So the PEF says, well, let's just do everything else: acidification, eutrophication, all these other impact categories along the value chain, because then you're going to get numbers that no one knows how, moles of nitrogen in the water. Who knows how to talk about that? But the PEF says, let's normalize this into a way that we can talk about it collectively and then balance out this. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity for marriage of that quantified theory within the donut economics concepts.
That's a really interesting point. And I think the normalization point is vital, because we don't talk about things because we don't understand them. And because we don't understand them, we don't take them seriously, so we don't measure them. But if we don't measure them, we can't have a conversation about what they are. If we have a common baseline of comparison, so, company X has got this much, company Y has got this much, we don't know what that means today. But once we start using the science to inform what that might mean, we might be able to actually talk about the implications of that. Is that really what we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the total implications. Here's an important aspect to think of, because I spoke to some companies and representatives in Africa where climate is not their first agenda, right? They want food and energy to people, right? Let's just say CO2 is not first on the agenda.
And again, we talked about trade-offs. What you're talking about is priorities, and it relates to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. In the end, if you need to make sure that people have got enough food to eat and water to drink, then bringing down your CO2 emissions is probably going to be lower in the hierarchy of the needs you need to be concerned about when you're deciding on what to finance.
Exactly. But, I guess what I'm advocating for is the way we go about the quantification is still a similar approach, right? We still want to do this bottom up. Just like we have a decarbonisation target, when we have a reduction in water pollution target, right?
Yeah.
An increase in potable water target. I got to share this anecdote story. I was in New York State. I was up in the Adirondacks as a younger guy with my father, and we had caught a fish out of the lakes, and really excited. It was a nice big walleye, and we cooked it up. And then we read that you're only supposed to eat one a month, if that.
Ooh.
And there's,
is that because of pollution?
Well, it's a number of things. The logging activities that took place in that entire area a couple decades ago, or if not 100 years ago, right? Well, actually closer to 100 years. But also the acid rain that comes from the coal that was being mined in Pennsylvania and comes up. And so here you're in this, what looks like a beautifully pristine area, much similar to Norway in many respects. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you find out that, guess what? The fish that you just caught out of this pristine lake and you're away on a camping trip is not nearly as fresh and clean as you would hope. And that's the hidden component of all this that is just continues to shock me, right? Like, our base for normalcy and what we think is okay is just understood as, oh, well, this is just how it is, and it seems right, and I don't see anything. It might, must be okay. You could say that with the climate as well. I don't see anything. I don't feel anything. It must be okay. Yeah. But and then when you actually do the measurements and you understand, well, these are our thresholds, these are the toxicities, here's the way the systems are all interacting with each other. Oh dear, we have to pay attention. Like, and so that asks the much more the proactive questions of what do we do next.
That's a wonderful way of looking at it, because you're basically talking about is that what we're understanding about the reason we need to take action on climate is the interconnectedness of all of these different parts, so that what happens in one place can have an impact in another, but that you can't see it. And what you're trying to do is make visible the invisible interconnections so that we can truly understand what it is we're trying to do and where we can make effective change. Wonderful.
We can repeat that one a couple times, Felicia. Like, this is one for your Shaken Not Burned audience to take home. It's the systems thinking. How are these all playing together in the ways that we are not readily seeing, but we only start to see once we measure, quantify, and know the difference of
that. That's really, really well put. And I think this question of systems thinking is so important because it's about making the invisible visible again, because we all exist within systems in the same way that the economy exists within nature and society. You can't exist without living within a system. But so it almost seems like there's a narrative that these underlying explanations of sustainability are too complex. They're not related to anything real in what we do. And I think part of the challenge with that is the narratives that we use. So you talked about making it clear because of the way we measure things. That is a narrative about how we understand the world around us and how we actually implement change. What sort of narratives do you think are taking us down the wrong road?
We take a lot of data for granted that's presented to us. There's when a lot of times when we go and re-examine of the methodologies of how this data was assembled and collected, and I'm referring a lot to CO2 emissions and data sets that we just take for granted.
Yeah.
And I'll be very high level here because a lot of it is very good. There's decades of research behind it. But then also we find the way certain things are represented to not be inclusive of the whole story. And what's the word here? It's called system boundary.
Yeah.
Right. And just for your listeners, in the concept of the electric car, are we only looking at the system boundary of the use phase of the electric vehicle? Or are we looking at the system boundary of the entire value chain from producing all the components to the end of life and recycling of that vehicle? And it's not just electric vehicles we're talking about. It's every product and every input and output across countries, companies, industries, sectors. Those specific system boundaries have been chosen at one point or another. And the information is arguably right. The information's arguably right, but is it the whole story that we need to uncover where the real challenges are that we need to address?
A huge part of this is just people not understanding the terms. We need to link them to reality and we need to make them part of everyday conversation, because it's once we normalize that this is the way you do things, then it stops being a conversation that is only really open to experts who've trained in the terminology and they understand the implications, and actually becomes part of everyday life.
You're polluting and you have your system boundary that cuts off before the pollution. Your system boundary data point says you're clean.
Yeah.
Right?
We have to take a broader view, just an understanding of the implications. So you mentioned earlier that with regard to the Paris Agreement, we are at this point where things are just beginning to bite. What I'm interested in is, if we go and look ahead 10 years from now, what would success look like for you? How do you think companies will think and act differently if we actually get the measurement approach right?
I think we're going to see a lot more movement of capital, and that's going to be indicative of good momentum and things happening. Now, granted, this could be a positive correlation with the movement of capital, or it could just be we're trading back and forth and making money on the margins, but nothing's actually happening. I try to look at both sides of this at all the time, right? But what does it mean? From my perspective, is that with this Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions, you've got enough checkpoints, presumably along the way. Paperwork is very rigorous. There's a lot of steps to get projects approved. I will say that the more I learned about this Paris Accord and all the nuances and all the high level thought that went into it, there is a lot covered. Right? And they really want to make sure there's high quality projects and efforts going in here. So looking 10 years ahead, if nothing were to happen, let's say at least we're quantifying a lot more. And I would say that quantifying significantly more is definitely a win in the right direction, because then it's understanding again where your hotspots are and what you can do about that. But what does 10 years look like? Okay, we've actually on the country level chosen the projects that are going to help us abate our own country emissions. And since as a side effect of that system and a success of that system, it means we're actually reducing our emissions. And the way these credits work, some get saved with the countries. The airlines will buy some, the shipping sector will buy some. They'll have to, by law, compensate for their own emissions. So have purchasing mandates.
Yep.
So that's happening. And you end up with a system that is actually reinforcing itself. And And mind you, where is this money coming from to invest in these projects? Well, it's coming from various countries, but it's also coming from the taxes themselves and the fines themselves, right? So anytime that the ship goes into the European ports and we've got the mileage counter on it, the nautical miles, and says, okay, you use this much fuel, that capital is going into the fund, which is then redeployed to keep the wheels turning. And I think the cyclical nature that they've created with this finance mechanism can actually work. I'm very optimistic. I'm like, wow, there's some smart people that put this together, and that's why it took so long.
Yeah.
That's why it took so long. But the mechanisms there, if the momentum of this system is working, I think that we are on a very good pathway to success because it's maintaining the system boundaries, it's maintaining accountability. We're actually showing all the world how we're communicating on this one singular topic. But as you said, what's next in the background? It's not just CO2. We've got all these other system thinkings that are right on the horizon.
Even though we know we've got a lot of things we're going to need to address, I love the optimism of your view on where we are, because I think that's a really powerful part of the conversation. If you can actually see how things can change, they can change. It's one of the things that I think is never factored into is that human part of it is if you actually think things can be different, you can then be part of making things different because that's what people do. And it's the people part. Now, I'm going to ask you, what is one question that whether you're in business, you're an investor, or just somebody walking around minding their own business, what is the question we should ask that would let us know whether or not a particular impact claim is real, is meaningful, or it's just marketing?
I ask myself that one every day. And I have a degree.
You know more than we do, so we're looking for a steer in the right direction.
How to know if the number's right.
Yeah, I'm not even asking how to know if the number's right, because you can't know if the number's right unless you know everything about the methodology, how it was done, how it was approached, how it came together, where the system boundaries are. I think what I'm asking for is there a question we can ask that lets us know whether something has meaning or not? What is it we should look for? Because no one looking at the outside at some claim is going to be able to understand the extent to which it's real.
The question is, what are you doing about it?
That's a really valid point.
Right? Okay. Because if it is of interest and it is of focus, then it's a data point. And just as you would have any other KPI in your company, you'd want to have a success indicator. And what is the action item? Now, it might be to, on a product level, to get your carbon intensity or whichever planetary metric down to a certain threshold. Okay, we're looking to cut by 50% over there. And this is like SBTI mentality, right? But I do think that's the question of, okay, you posted the number, but what does it mean to you? Yeah.
So in a sense, what you're saying is what's important when you're looking at this is to ask not what are you saying, but what are you doing?
Yeah, I guess it's always, yeah.
One of the things that I keep coming back to is that while this is a world of extreme complication and acronym and specific professional terminology that many people feel is designed to keep them out of the conversation, it actually is all quite basic. It's not what you're saying, it's what you're doing. If you can use simple language to explain it, I think it would make a lot more sense to everybody. But maybe we're not quite there yet because we have to keep it complicated because we're still arguing about how we define it.
And this is we have a sister company that deals with helping corporates invest in those new technologies, right? And so one of our LPs is a travel company. So what's the biggest part of their missions is the airlines being used by their clients.
Of course.
Going to their hotels and all over the place, right? So that's a downstream scope 3. It's so close and yet so far to them. But they come to us and say, well, what can we invest in now that's going to help us fix this over time, right? We know that this is a challenge. This is something that is massive, and you could take all our office buildings and pile that up, but that's not anything compared to all of our travelers. What technologies can we can state that, hey, we recognize that this is something we need to address. Help us strategize so that we can purchase the amount we need, invest the amount of capital that we need, so we can plan ahead for this point of convergence that says, you know what? This is where we're going to be in 2030. This is where we're going to be in 2040. we're not good enough today, but we at least have a theory and we have a plan of action that's measurable, quantifiable, and one that's going to align with our targets.
So I think I've taken up so much of your time this morning, and I'm not going to apologize because it's been fascinating. But is there something I haven't asked you that you think we should have talked about?
I always get the question of what's my role
Yeah.
as an individual. As a co-founder of ClimatePoint and as an entrepreneur, I continue to see that as one of the best vehicles and best pathways for someone to really be an activist and take on that leadership role to effectively change the world. Now, granted, eating less and traveling less in airplanes, okay, great. You're contributing and you've got that mindset. I want to ask and challenge you, for the individuals out there and the young aspiring entrepreneurs, the change makers, right? What technology are you going to invent? What problem are you going to solve? How are you going to scale and grow this and communicate your ideas on an international market so that you can actually make systemic change that is going to flip this? And that's essentially what I want to see. And if we more young entrepreneurs bring their ideas to market, everything from textiles, circular economy, energy, batteries, sea, mobility. Involve yourself in these communities. See how you can help. Find out where that added value is. See what those technology interests are. There's so many ways that you can leverage your intelligence, leverage your outlook, leverage these sustainable mindsets and bring them out to the world. That's going to have multiplying effects beyond your household. And that's where I want everyone to really embrace and see what their inner motivation is pushing for.
Thank you for that, Nick, because not only is that a really important message, I think, for entrepreneurs out there and those looking to develop the market, but actually, I think it's a really powerful message in terms of the way people think. It comes back to what I was saying about if you believe you can make change, you can make change. And it's about taking where you are and what you know and the leverage you have, no matter how great or small it might be, and just going, this makes a difference. Even if you're just choosing to think about things differently so that you have different conversations, that's how you change norms. That's how you change the framework that lets people create, deploy, and scale new ideas, new technologies, all of these different things. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
I think, just to recap what we've talked about, I think really what it boils down to is you're providing a new way of looking at impact measurement. If we are sensible, we can use impact measurement as a strategic lever for change, not just a compliance issue. But really, we want to shift the mindsets of everyone in all these different markets. Create different norms, find ways of normalizing the different things that we need to pay attention to, and find structured ways of showing this is a benefit if you do it in the right way.
And I think you summed that up quite lovely, Felicia. That what I want to emphasize is that because we have so much of emergence of accountability and carbon accounting and these systems in place, that is absolutely a step in a very productive direction, right? ClimatePoint is saying that's a perfect foundation. How can we improve upon that? Where can we be better? And that's where we say, let's look at that whole life cycle. Let's look at that scope 4 avoided. Let's look at how your individual corporate actions can relate to the nationally determined contributions of the country. We're not saying anybody's wrong. We're saying we think there's a better way with the common methodologies that we can tell this story better. And one that actually, if we're bringing this all the way back to shareholders, one that can actually reinforce your business opportunities and continue to grow your market share.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end this on. It's a fantastic call to action. Once again, Nick, thank you so much to our listeners. I really hope you've enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. Don't forget to share and subscribe. And we will be back soon.
Thank you very much.